about approaches to effectively use pathogenomics for wheat crop protection against rust. And then we have Dr. Andy DeRocher from the University of Alberta, and his topic is climate change and polar bear life history vulnerabilities. And another University of Alberta speaker the following week, Dr. James Cahill. He'll be speaking on notes from underground, a behavioral perspective of plant foraging. And then we have Dr. Moro Akinfajie from TRU, and his talk will be around invasive species, I think, most likely. And then we have Drs. Jabad Tamel and Jan Siborowski. Jabad is a new faculty member at TRU, and Jan is from the University of Calgary. And their talk will be centering around ecological breakpoint models. And then we'll finish off with a talk from John Woods from Parks Canada, and his talk will be focused on the Canada chain. So a great lineup, and I want to see you all back here for each and every one of them. And I promise, Lisa, I need your title.
Someone asked you something.
If you haven't done so already, there's coffee and donuts here, and I promise those to continue. No promises for next semester. If you've got any ideas for talks for next semester, talk to Louis Goslin. He coordinates the series in the winter. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker today. Kirsten Hannam is from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Research Station at Summerland. She did her master's at UBC. As it turns out, the world works in funny ways, right? So I did my master's at UBC. My master's was done out in northern Vancouver Island as part of the SHERP project, the Slough Cedar Hemlock Integrated Research Program.
You got it.
And as it happened, so did Chris. And I didn't know this because we didn't overlap. And weirdly enough, Lisa, who's going to be talking in a couple of weeks, shared the same supervisor as Kirsten at UBC. Crazy business. Kirsten went on to do her PhD at the University of Alberta. She's been wildly successful. She's been working at different areas. She's now got a permanent position at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and she's got a whole host of publications, really interesting work, and really interested to hear what she has to share with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Luck. So can everybody hear me all right? Yes? Okay, right. Just holler if I get too quiet. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Locke. As he mentioned, I recently joined Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as an agroecologist, but I've also worked a little bit in forestry over the years, so I'm fortunate to take a tiny bit of knowledge from a few different fields and combine them into this new position that they've created at Ag Canada called agroecology. And today I'm going to talk about some work. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this because I feel like I'm zooming in and out. Is that better or worse? Worse? Okay. Okay. Better? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about a few different projects, some of which build on work that was started by colleagues, in particular Denise Nielsen, who recently retired from Agriculture Canada, but has started us on some neat crop suitability modeling projects that I'm continuing on. And I'm also going to talk about some work looking at how different crop types in the Okanagan Valley affect soil carbon storage. So that's a project that I'm working on closely with Melanie Jones and Andy Midwood at UBC Okanagan. Okay, so about some research addressing two main questions today. First of all, how might climate change alter what we grow and where? My research is focused on the Okanagan Valley. And then what could those changes in crops mean for soil carbon storage? The Summerland Research and Development Center has a really amazingly long climate record. We've been collecting weather data at the station since 1914, when the research station was first established by the federal government as the Dominion Agricultural Research Station. And when we look at the data that have been collected over that more than 100 years, we see some really interesting patterns. We see that every year the annual number of days over 35 degrees Celsius has been increasing over the last 30 or so years. And over that same period of time, the last 30 years or so, we've seen the number of days less than 20 degrees Celsius decreasing. So we're getting, in the Summerland area, much hotter summers and much warmer winters. And another big change that's happening across the Okanagan Valley is massive population growth. So these data are taken from BC Statistics, and you can see, particularly for the central Okanagan, that over the last 30 years, the population has more than doubled. And the light green dots indicate the projected population change into the future, and we see that the number of people moving to the Okanagan Valley is only going to continue to increase. So this puts huge pressure on the agricultural land that we have in the valley. There's a lot of desire to convert those agricultural fields to suburbs. So growers are being called to grow more food on an ever-shrinking land base, or shifting where they're growing the food elsewhere. And we see evidence of land use change occurring in the Okanagan Valley over a relatively short periods of time. So there were 2 land use surveys conducted in the Okanagan Valley in 2006 and then again in 2014. And we saw a really strong decrease in the amount of land being used to grow apples, but massive increases, almost a doubling of, or almost an increase of 50% of the amount of area dedicated to growing cherries, and similar increases in the area being used to grow grapes. And these trends are being driven by a number of factors, but cherry producers in the valley have found that they can make really good money by exporting to China. So there's a huge draw to grow cherries. The grape industry is driven a lot by this increase in ecotourism, and you can make relatively large amounts of money growing grapes and producing wine, whereas the apple industry is struggling. So we're interested in trying to understand how future changes in crop suitability driven by climate change will manifest themselves across the landscape. So my predecessor, Denise Nielsen, started this work, and she did a series of modeling exercises where she pulled together several different groups of data to try and understand where across the Okanagan Valley can we grow crops, where across the Okanagan Valley does the climate vary, and then how do those positions within the Okanagan Valley, how are they suitable based on soil requirements and weather requirements? How are they suitable to grow specific crops? So we need 3 pieces of information. We need information across the landscape about soil and landscape suitability for a given crop. We need information on daily weather data, and we need models that predict how suitable a site will be to grow a crop given temperature and agroclimatic data for individual years. So I'll dig into this a little bit more. So we have accessible, anyone can download these from the Data BC warehouse. We have geospatial data across the Okanagan Valley that give us information on the slope across the landscape, how stony that soil is, what the texture is. And we've used this information to develop a mesh over the Okanagan Valley surface that predicts where we can grow crops. Tree fruits are special in that they can grow in much more coarse textured soils than a lot of crops. They can have a lot more coarse fragments, so they can be more stony than a lot of crops. So they're less picky than, say, growing corn. And they can grow on much steeper slopes. So there are areas that can grow tree crops or vines that can't grow a lot of other crops, but it's still quite restricted. There are large areas of the Okanagan Valley that are too steep, or it's bare soil, or there's way too many rocks. So we used all this information to produce this this map of the suitable sites and soils across the Okanagan Valley that gave us an idea of the land base on which we could grow these crops. And then we needed information, we needed daily weather data. So as I mentioned, we have a climate station at the Summerlin Research Center. We have Environment Canada has climate stations all across the valley. And we worked closely with Alex Cannon, who works for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, federal agency, to develop 500-meter grid daily weather surfaces for every day of the year from the 50s all the way up until the present. And we use this information to compare, to help us understand on an individual day, does that temperature meet the requirements for a given crop that we're interested in? So we can look and say, what's the minimum temperature? What was the minimum temperature on December 29th, 1968? And all those climate station data from across the valley are used to kind of compile this information. We interpolate between these climate stations and get a full climate surface at quite a high resolution across the whole valley, so that we can understand on a given day and a given year what was the temperature regime at that spot. And we also use those daily weather data to calculate a series of agroclimatic indices. So we can say at this location in this year, how long was the growing season? How long was the period from the last frost in the fall to the, is that right? No, how long was the period from the last frost in the spring to the first frost in the fall? How long was that period where we could grow a crop? And how many growing degree days, or how much accumulated amount of heat was there available to produce a given crop? And that will affect what can grow where. And finally, we need a series of crop suitability models that help us understand at a given time of year and sensitivity period of the development of a crop, are those requirements met at a given location? So at this orchard, does it ever get too cold for a cherry tree to survive? Does it ever get too hot for apples to be produced? We have a whole kind of series of questions that we put together, and using these algorithms, we can calculate or predict whether a given site will be suitable for a given crop. So we ask, in addition, questions like, are the temperatures through the spring just right so that they're not frozen? During the growing season, as I mentioned, do we get enough warm days that we can produce a crop all the way to maturity? Particularly relevant for apples, are the temperatures cool enough in the autumn to encourage that color development that an apple producer needs to get a high quality apple? Is the temperature just right in the autumn that the trees can reach and then complete dormancy to protect those trees from the cold? And is the temperature just right in the winter that those little nascent flower buds won't get frozen? So we have this whole series of questions that apply to different times of the year that help us predict or determine whether a specific crop will be suitable for growing in a specific location. And using these three kind of groups of information, the site and soil suitability, the weather data, and then the crop suitability models, we can predict across the landscape what crops can grow where. And these maps were again generated by Denise Nielsen and her colleagues, and they show the changing distribution of crops of sweet cherry suitability across the Okanagan Valley from 1961 all the way up to 2010. And the areas indicated in green are areas where the site and soil were suitable for growing sweet cherry and the climate was also suitable. So in the 1960s up to 1970, our models show that sweet cherry could best be produced really far in the south around Osoyoos and up around Kelowna close to the lake. But as climate started to warm, the suitable area for growing sweet cherry expanded to approximately what we see now. And we feel fairly confident that these models are accurately predicting crop suitability across the landscape in the Okanagan Valley because we're seeing, as indicated by those red arrows, that commercial growers are starting to plant sweet cherry orchards farther north and higher up the valley sides because they're finding that they can mature a crop and they won't lose it to frost in areas where several decades ago they couldn't have thought of doing that. So our models are kind of predicting what the growers are doing on the ground. So we feel fairly confident that they're doing what we want them to do. But now we're interested in trying to understand what crop suitability might look like in the future. We know that we can expect the climate to continue to warm quite dramatically, and to help us and growers anticipate those changes, we want to try and imagine what a future would look like. Where will future cherry orchards best be grown? So we're starting to integrate information from global circulation models that we've selected from a suite of models that form part of a CMIT-5 exercise that is an international effort to compare the results of all these different international global circulation models to try and understand what is the most likely scenario that we can see in the future. So we've started this effort using a model from home, the CANI-SM2 model, and we're using these data to model past climates and then look at climate into the future and try and understand how might that crop suitability change with time in a future climate. And then the next stage will be to pull in other models and compare them amongst each other. But we're starting with this guy. So these maps you see are very, very hot off the press. I got them, what's today? Thursday. I got them last Friday. Okay, so this map is for the whole Okanagan Valley. It shows calculated sweet cherry suitability according to the CANI-SM2 model for the 1950s. And the data in red shows, indicates that between 8 and 10 years out of the 1950s decade, cherries could not be grown. So it's saying in the 1950s, a sweet cherry orchard, you'd be insane to plant one over here. Don't do it in the red zone. But the areas in light green, which you can see up here around Summerland and Penticton, you could probably successfully grow cherries 6 to 8 out of the 10 years. So that might be an area where a grower could hedge his bets and perhaps plant a sweet cherry orchard and expect to make a profit or be able to produce a viable crop more years than not. Okay, so then let's see what our modeling shows as we move through time. If we skip forward 50 years to the 2000s, we see just the kind of pattern that we've observed, that sweet cherry suitability is expanding farther north and farther up the valley sides, and it's concentrated around Kelowna, Summerland and Penticton, Oliver, just like we see in real life. And then, if we go to the 2050s, this model is predicting huge changes in what we can grow and where. suddenly, according to this model, we could be growing cherries really high up in elevation. So this is confirming that into the future, we can expect that the crops that we can grow are probably going to shift. And although this model is only one estimate of how that might look, it does suggest to us, given our comparison with historical data, that where orchards are planted into the future is going to be very different than what they are now. So if we compile all the information from those modeling exercises into one figure, I tried to do it with this. Again, this is like hot off the press, so if it doesn't work, we'll find out. But this is, across the x-axis, is a summary by decade. So this is sweet cherry suitability in the 1950s, all the way up to around 2050. And you know how I mentioned there were different components in the crop suitability model? So we asked questions like, does it get too hot or cold? Will the flowers be frozen? Do we have a long enough growing season? So that's what's down the y-axis, the results of the different individual components of the crop suitability model. And I wanted to look at this to see what was driving the changes in crop suitability through time. So you can see early on, there were questions about cold temperatures. So it seemed like crop suitability was being largely determined by winter temperatures. Oh, sorry, I should have explained the scale. So these data are a summary of all the data points for the climate across the landscape. So we added them all up, and we just calculated a proportion that were suitable. So in the 1950s, only 25% of that whole area that we saw on the map was suitable for growing sweet cherries, and the rest were considered unsuitable because the flowers would be damaged in the winter. So the more yellow it is indicates that that factor is driving unsuitability. And as it goes to dark red or dark green, that factor becomes less important. So with time, according to our modeling, it looks like winter cold becomes less of a problem, but we see a hint that maybe things might be getting too hot in some areas. So that's kind of interesting. Of course, now we want to look at a whole suite of other models just to confirm that this isn't just a fluke. But our colleagues to the south are doing some similar kinds of work. So these are just screen grabs from a climate toolbox that's just put out by the USDA that was set up to try and help growers imagine, again, where crops can be grown under future climates. So these maps are showing changes in the extent of almond growing regions in the Pacific Northwest. So the figure up here, in the very dark green, you can see that's the current extent of almond orchards, and it's all focused in California. But the climate models are suggesting that there, between the 70s and 2000s, there was a larger area that was climatically suitable for almonds. And then they modeled into the future using a whole suite of those global circulation models. And these models suggest that between 2010 and 2040, the area that's climatically suitable for growing almonds is going to expand. And then up into the 2070s, people might, according to this suite of models, be able to grow almonds up around Seattle. So these results are kind of confirming some of the things that we're also seeing, that in the future, we need to start anticipating what kind of crops we might be able to grow and where we might be able to grow them. So I gave a version of this presentation a few weeks ago to some visiting students from Germany, and they said, oh, so does this mean climate change is really good for agriculture in the Okanagan Valley? Suddenly you can grow cherries everywhere. So I thought I better make it clear that there are a few other things we need to consider. For example, those warmer temperatures are not only going to affect what plants can grow, they're also going to have a really strong effect on the insects and pests that we have. So 2 recent examples are the apple clearwing moth, which was first, we think, introduced almost 20 years ago, and the spotted winged Drosophila, which was first found just in BC in 2009. And both of those insects have had massive economic implications for growers in the Okanagan Valley. Spotted winged Drosophila has totally transformed how we grow cherries now and is requiring way higher inputs of pesticides to manage it and make sure that there's actually a cherry crop to harvest. And the apple clearwing moth has been a problem for almost 2 decades. But it's been associated with a recent phenomenon that apple growers are experiencing that we're calling rapid or sudden apple decline, where orchardists are experiencing massive collapses of their orchards in some places. And it's a really strange thing where the trees will have an apple crop growing on their tree, and it'll look a little chlorotic, and maybe the leaves are a bit spindly, and then in a couple days, the tree is just dead. And the worst year was last year, but we're seeing a lot of it again this year. And apple clearwing moth is one of the pests that is believed to be associated with it. They think that burrowing of the moth may be exacerbating the drought effects and inhibiting the tree's ability to pump water up into its crop and just pushes these trees over the edge. There are a lot of other associated causes that are suspected to play a role, but apple clearwing moth is one of them. We're also seeing, as I mentioned earlier, really marked changes in weather. Warmer summers, warmer winters. We've also had a couple really crazy flood years in the Okanagan Valley in 2017 and 18. All of us across the province have experienced record-breaking wildfires in 3 out of the last 5 years. And in 2017, we had this amazing drought. We had 73 consecutive days with no rain in Summerland, where usually at most we get 42, 44 dry days. So we're having some kind of wacky things happening. And those longer, warmer growing seasons also have massive implications for how much water we need. You can see the trend in 30-year normals for the growing season. That burgundy box is really bumped up, meaning we have a lot longer to grow these crops. And at the same time, our summers are getting warmer, and our snowpacks are becoming increasingly unreliable. So we're going to need a lot more water, and we're going to be able to count on that water potentially less. So again, Denise Nielsen published a paper recently using the agricultural water demand model to try and understand how climate change might increase or decrease the demand for irrigation water across the province. And she included several regions of the Okanagan Valley. In all cases, it looks like that change in climate has the potential to increase the area that might be able to be used for agriculture, but at the same time, we're also getting associated massive increases in the amount of water we're going to need to supply to those agricultural areas. So all of this needs to be considered when we try and make sure that we can adapt our agricultural practices to the coming changes. Okay, so I'm going to conclude this section by just reminding you that we've done quite a bit of work to try and anticipate, to compile the available data in a way that we can try and anticipate changing crop suitability with climate change. So efforts to date have included compiling soil and landscape data and climate data and crop suitability models to try and predict across the landscape or monitor where we can grow sweet cherries or apples. And we found that the modeling outputs mirror what the commercial growers are showing us. that we are seeing shifting areas in which we can grow crops, and sweet cherries can now be grown farther north and farther uphill than we have been able to do in the past. And hopefully, using climate models to predict future climates, we can try and understand where those crops might shift in the future to help us sort of arm ourselves and make sure we've got the infrastructure in place to provide the water that we need to deal with any new or increasing pests and help support growers as they try and keep producing food for us. Okay, so that's part one. The second part of the work that I thought I might describe to you is some efforts we're doing to try and understand how changing crops across the landscape might alter soil carbon storage. And you're probably aware of this to some degree. It's in the media a lot that we now understand that the climate and the vegetation in an area and the soil properties all work together to determine how much soil carbon there is stored. And this matters because we're really interested in understanding methods that can help us pull carbon dioxide out of the air and keep it there. And one of the main methods that seems to get a lot of attention these days is soil carbon sequestration. And in that practice or that effort, CO2 is pulled out of the air through photosynthesis, and it produces plant biomass. And then if we can get that plant biomass into the soil by adding it as compost or increasing root biomass and keeping it in that soil, then maybe we can help pull down the amount of CO2 that's in the air. So this figure comes from the IPCC report that came out in 2018, trying to compile information on the efforts that would be required to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. And they did basically a massive literature review, which they summarized in this figure, which shows across the x-axis the amount of CO2 that could be pulled out of the atmosphere, and then on the y-axis, the cost. And soil carbon sequestration was deemed to be one of the most effective and cheapest methods. Plus, it has a lot of other side benefits. It helps soils hold on to water and nutrients. It's usually associated with increased productivity. And this idea of soil carbon sequestration as a means of mitigating climate change is receiving a huge amount of interest. This is just one example that came to my mailbox, the Teraton Challenge, where it's basically like a carbon hacking effort where they're trying to get people to generate new ideas and monetize that for increasing soil carbon for climate change mitigation. You have till October 1st to apply. You have 5 days. Okay. So the Okanagan Valley typically has really low soil organic matter. It's a semi-arid climate, and so plant productivity is naturally low. There isn't a lot of water that falls through precipitation. So the soils are very poor in carbon. They're not very fertile, and they're very coarse textured in general, so they also do a poor job of holding onto the nutrients and water that we add to them. Because of this, they're quite susceptible to acidification. We found that orchards and vineyards that are irrigated with drip irrigation can become acidified because the water and nutrients are being applied to a very constrained spot in the soil, and that is in part because they don't have a lot of carbon or organic matter in them. They're susceptible to leaching losses, and they're also susceptible to the development of large populations of soil-borne pests, which means that it can sometimes be hard to plant a new orchard or vineyard on an old one because there's kind of this buildup of a big population of pathogens in the soil, which needs to often be dealt with before you can replant. And because of this, there have been a huge number of projects looking at how organic matter amendments can be used to improve soil carbon storage. So my colleague Tom Forge, he specializes in nematology, and he and his colleagues have found that adding organic amendments such as compost or organic surface mulches can really improve soil health and improve your ability to replant an orchard after an old one has been pulled out, and it promotes tree growth. Some work I did while I was a postdoc at the research station, we showed that organic matter amendments such as bark chip mulch can be used to improve water and nutrient retention, which would in theory help reduce your irrigation water needs and your fertilizer needs. And another colleague at UBC Okanagan found that organic matter amendments that are really carbon rich can be used to reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that's produced, which is good for two reasons. It improves the fertilizer use efficiency, that nitrogen isn't being lost as a nitrous oxide. And also nitrous oxide is a really strong greenhouse gas. So that's another good reason to try and suppress nitrous oxide emissions. But we were interested in trying to understand a different management practice, irrigation. How does irrigated agriculture alter the amount of soil carbon? And we were kind of interested to see, because agriculture in the Okanagan Valley is entirely reliant on irrigation. We can't have any viable agricultural productivity without irrigation. And we were really curious if by applying water to these very dry, very low productivity soils, could we demonstrate that we were actually promoting soil carbon storage? So this was a big project that we started with UBC Okanagan, and we collected samples from 18 uncultivated sites and 81 orchard and vineyard soils across the valley. So this is a map of all our sites here, and we tried to stratify by a whole range of variables that ended up not being that important, like soil texture and soil type. And I'll just show you a few quick, first I'll show you some more about the methods. So these are some examples of some orchards and vineyards. So I can show you that we collected samples in these drive rows here where the tractor or a person might walk, and we also collected samples under the tree or vine rows because we anticipated that there'd be quite different inputs. Often the water is directly added under the vines, whereas there's grasses in the drive row, so there's quite different inputs on those two positions within the orchard and the vineyard. And we collected samples down to 60 centimeters, and they were all sieved, and we determined organic carbon content. So I'll just show you a few graphs of our findings. The triangles indicate soil carbon concentration in the alley. So the alley is what I was calling the drive row, where the tractor goes. And then the circles show the concentration of carbon in the crop row, so under the apple or cherry tree or the vine. And then samples were collected at 3 depths, to the 0 to 15, 15 to 30, and 30 to 60 centimeters. So you can see that there's a strong trend of decreasing carbon with depth, which is not too surprising because at the surface is where the fruit drops and the leaves and most of the organic material is deposited right at the surface, other than the roots. And we also see this strong trend of higher carbon in the alley where the grass is growing than underneath the tree row. And we suspect that's because you can see that usually an herbicide strip is maintained directly under the tree to prevent competition between trees and weeds for water and nutrients. Okay, so these were data taken from drip irrigated apple orchards. But we also collected the same data from micro-sprinkler irrigated apple orchards, where the water is, instead of being deposited directly under the apple tree, it's spread across the surface of the orchard, and we see some interesting things. We see that the difference in the concentration of carbon between the tree row and the alley, or the crop row and the alley, is smaller. So we suspect that's because we're spreading the water around and there's greater plant productivity across the entire orchard surface. Okay, and then we also have data from drip irrigated grapes and micro sprinkler or microjet irrigated cherries. So we see some interesting kind of general trends. The soils under the apple tend to have quite strong differences in carbon between the alleys and the crop rows. We see that the soils under the grapes tend to have lower carbon in both the alleys and the crop row. And I should have put a picture with that one, but we suspect it's because grapes tend to apply a lot less water than orchards. They do this to kind of stress the vine, and that kind of promotes the grapes to produce a lot of sugars. And they are almost always drip irrigated, so they don't irrigate that drive row or that alley. And as a result, the vegetation between the vines tends to be really minimal. And then cherries tend to have the most carbon of all in both the drive row and the alley. And there are a couple things at play here. We think it's related to two factors. First of all, cherries tend to receive a lot of water, and they also tend to be quite big trees with really lush and abundant roots. They produce a lot more roots than apple rootstocks tend to. So we think that the cherries are just fixing a lot of carbon from the air, using all that water that they get, and they have really abundant roots, which are depositing carbon into the soil. So in general, soil carbon tends to be higher under cherries, which are usually microsprinkler irrigated, and lowest under the drip irrigated grapes, whereas the apples are kind of in between. And then I'm working with a colleague, Laurie Phillips, who is also with AAFC, but out in Ontario, to try and understand the carbon cycling genes in the soil to get a better handle on what the microbes are doing or what they're capable of doing in the soil. And then in the interest of time, I didn't include it, but we're also doing some stable isotope analysis, which can tell us how microbially processed the carbon is in the soil. So once this paper comes out, we should have kind of a good picture of how the orchard system, so the combination of crop type and irrigation type conspires together to put a whole bunch works together to determine how much carbon is put in the soil, and then how thoroughly the microbes are processing it, and so how strongly fixed it is in the soil. Okay, but sorry, I wanted to make one point. So ultimately, this project was initially started to try and understand the effects of irrigation on soil carbon storage. So the idea had been that we would compare how much carbon was in orchard or vineyard soils with undisturbed soils that had never been cultivated. And that proved to be really hard to find good sites to use as baseline, because viable agricultural land is almost all under plans already. It's already being used for agriculture, or it's being converted to a suburb. So getting baseline data was really, really hard. The second thing that I found kind of a bummer is we visited so many vineyards and orchards and forced them to fill out these big questionnaires to try and understand past management practices and what the previous crop was. And yet it really seems like the strongest determining factor of how much carbon was in the soil is what's growing there now. So to me, that makes me worry that this carbon that we see right now won't stay there. It really depends on what crop we're growing there, and if we convert it to something else, it'll just move to a new carbon level. So I'm interested to see that there were such distinct changes in soil carbon with crop and irrigation, but I'm not sure that these findings are going to help us identify management practices that would be good for fixing carbon into the soil for climate change mitigation, because I think the soil just really quickly shifts to a new system when we shift it that way. Okay. So I guess I'll conclude by saying that a lot of the work I'm doing right now is trying to anticipate how climate is going to change what we can grow and where, and what the implications of those changes will be for soil properties and how much water we have available to produce those crops. And hopefully that kind of information will help us to prepare ourselves for the future and identify management practices and crop varieties and policies, supportive policies that will help us maintain agriculture productivity into the future. And finally, I want to make it very clear that all of this work was done by a huge posse of people, including many, many, many students. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Kirsten.
You're
Time
welcome.
for questions.
Yes.
I gather that the maps you showed of the whole Okanagan region suitability in the 50s versus now in 2050 had no input from water availability at all. It was just strictly like temperature, rain, and soils.
These maps are just, crop suitability.
Yeah, so you say climate, it doesn't include water.
No, because we assume that it's reliant on irrigation.
Yeah.
So we don't account for the precipitation that comes in because we're assuming that we have sufficient water to irrigate. Yeah, but there are other tools, specifically stuff that Denise and her colleague Ted Vandergulik have worked really closely on an agricultural water demand model that can be used hand in hand with this output. So in the future, we hope to overlay, okay, we've got this future area where we could grow crops. What would the agricultural water demand look like? And then another key step that really needs to be done is to take stock of, okay, what water is available still. A lot of water, it's already spoken for, or the infrastructure isn't in place to deliver that to growers. So we need to start to look at, it will be a massive undertaking. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there probably needs to be a huge stock taking exercise. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Are there ways that we can incorporate drought-resistant traits into such crops using genetics?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How does that practice in BC?
As far as I know, people have been looking at that. So I don't know how many of you are aware that like an apple tree or a grapevine, it's not one whole unit. It's composed of a rootstock that's then grafted onto a scion. So rootstocks are often bred for optimal characteristics like its ability to resist cold or its ability to resist a certain disease. And so those rootstocks are then, the variety that we want is grafted onto that rootstock. So we are, for example, for the rapid apple decline project that I mentioned, we're trying to isolate orchards that have a high incidence of the rapid apple decline and a low incidence to see if rootstock, for example, plays a role in that. And one of the tools that we're going to use is to look at the growth rings of the tree and look at, maybe this is a little bit too much to get into, but the 13C signature, so the isotopic signature of the growth rings, and that will tell us how much drought that tree has been susceptible to. So we'll be able to compare among rootstocks and see if certain trees with a certain type of rootstock tend to be more enriched in 13C, then they may be more susceptible to drought. So right now, that's not like a breeding program per se, but we're trying to relate that to rootstock and see if we have tools that could identify drought susceptibility among rootstocks. But there are certainly breeding programs, and there's a breeding program at the research center that can start to look at those kinds of things. Yeah. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering if you did a comparison between organic growers and regular growers at all?
We included growers of all types. Almost anybody who said yes, we would take them. And so there were organic growers and conventional growers included in that survey. And there were a couple organic growers that had, I can think of two that had really high organic matter compared to the rest of the growers in that category, because they tended to add a lot of compost to their soils. So we saw from that perspective that at least at the surface, the compost additions for sure were showing up as increased carbon. But we didn't have enough samples from organic versus not organic growers to be able to test any effects per se. But we did see a couple kind of outliers that tended to be associated with organic growers. Oh, I'll go to Brendan and then I'll come back to you.
I was wondering if we could go back to those model groups of like 2000 and then 2050.
Yes.
I think I remember.
This.
Yeah, that one. What happened? I just noticed on the map there in between Peachland went all red. What happened?
Right up
Yeah,
there?
sorry, where Summerland is in Peachland.
Oh,
There's a little section
right
that
there.
went all red. And I think
Yeah.
previously on the other maps, it's viable area to grow, correct? Oh no, it's not. Okay. Oh my bad.
Yeah,
I
that's
was
okay.
wondering what happened in that little pocket area. Everything's viable around it. And then
Yeah, you know, I will say that there are some wonky things here, because I think, now let me think, I think this is just related to, it's very low down near the water and it's facing west, and so it may just be too hot. But there were several funny things that we've noticed that we thought we need to just go back to the output and like locate those climate grid spots and make sure that we feel good about what it's saying, because there's some weird things here too,
right. Okay.
which I don't really understand. That's what I thought you were going to ask, because I don't really understand why this suddenly went. Is that right? Oh no. Okay. Yeah. There was something. No, it wasn't that. But this for sure, we have to go back and look and make sure, because this is sort of a summary of all those different sort of individual tests together. So what we need to do is look at the layers by each of those tests so that we can understand, oh, what is it that's driving that? Because I think in some places it's too hot, in some places it's too cold, and those are kind of shifting around. And sometimes it's predictions of the timing of things. So if the spring sort of shifts one way or the other, it can hit like a developing flower right at the wrong time when it's just too hot for it or too cold for it. So yeah, we really need to dig into, okay, what is the cause of some of these funny little spots that seem weird? Yeah. Yes.
So, in Kamloops this year, like, we lost almost all our apricot crop because we had cold snap in February. And I've read that climate change becomes more of a factor in more sort of extreme weather events. Now, has that been factored into your models at all?
Yeah, one way in particular it does is this, especially for the winter. As trees go into dormancy, it sort of needs to be a gradual decline. So what happened in 2010, for example, in the valley, is the temperature was sort of ramping down as it should to allow the trees to enter their dormancy phase, and then it just dropped. And that didn't give the trees enough time to acclimate or go into dormancy, and a lot of them were lost. So in that case, it's a shift in kind of the timing. It was just a kind of an event that doesn't normally happen. So in that case, that cold temperature hit at a very sensitive time for trees to during their entering dormancy period. So what you're talking about is that phase when the flowers are just on the tree, but sometimes in the spring, as the temperature's warm, they slowly become less and less cold sensitive. So as they're coming out of that cold hardiness phase, if suddenly the temperature drops, it may drop below where the tree is kind of expecting that range to be in, and it can just knock them out. And that's always happens. Sometimes there's just kind of freaky things, but there could be more and more of kind of a disconnect between what the tree is prepared for and the kind of temperature fluctuations that you see in the weather. Especially sensitive are those shoulder seasons, as trees are going into and coming out of dormancy is when they can be particularly sensitive. And it just depends on the variety that
So have you noticed like an increase in these sort of random extreme events, or has it been consistent, would you say? I guess it's sort of hard question to ask.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to say with confidence. This is kind of a new field to me, but I would say that we've certainly seen those things happen, and with this model, this sort of model suite, we can look for those events in the past. Now that we have this sort of fine-scale historical climate data, so we can backtrack and see, how frequently did this happen in the past, and how frequently is it happening now? And we haven't done those kind of analyses, but we certainly see wacky things. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Are you doing this modeling for all BC? Like, do you have this data for the whole Thompson Okanagan? Because we're seeing, for example, wineries come up, the place used to be the apple orchards are gone, and all this. So you've got your basically, even Vancouver Island, we're seeing wineries come up.
Yes.
Places I never thought I'd see wineries. So it's just, you have all this data.
We have all the data for all the province, and we have plans to expand it elsewhere. So with this map, you can see actually we went farther into the Shuswap than we did with Denise's previous work. So we are starting to cover larger and larger areas. And some of the sweet cherry suitability modeling Denise has actually done for the Thompson, I'm pretty sure. It was published in, I don't know, this paper here. I think, I'm pretty sure that paper includes the Thompson region. So there are plans, we're hoping that we can do some more crop suitability modeling for across the province for a range of crops. So Agriculture Canada also has this land suitability rating system, which is used to look at crop suitability for alfalfa, corn, barley, oats, and we're hoping to do some of that modeling to look at changes across the province, and then this tree fruit work, and maybe we'll develop some for new crops. We'll see how funding goes.
Where do the data come from? Do you have little sensors in each of those little grids, or is it satellite? How do you get the data from those elements of your grid?
So the historical climate data is collected from climate stations across the province, and then it's mathematically interpolated between. So it takes into account topographical effects, and I have to admit, we leave it to the experts to do it. They just give us the data. So the finicky details of how mathematically they do it, I'm not sure, but they take the climate station data and they interpolate between, and then taking into account things like where the lake is and topographical features, they kind of infill the gaps. but there are certainly gaps across the province, and there is an effort to kind of fill those gaps and install or take in climate stations from other agencies to try and improve those data. And then the global circulation model output, again, those models are done for the whole globe, and then we have experts that statistically downscale the data, so take those big low resolution data and make finer 500 meter square resolution data for us using mathematical things that they just hand it to me, and I thank them. So yeah, it's a big team.
We don't want to go on forever. Susan, well, okay, Jesse, and are you guys short questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm verbose, sorry.
All right.
I'll be fast.
So you didn't analyze any soil samples from like naturally vegetated landscapes?
We did do 18 sites,
Yeah.
but you know, it was a real struggle, and a lot of them, when I looked at them, I just didn't feel confident that I could say this is a good quality site that would be selected to be an orchard. So I chose not to include the undisturbed areas, because a lot of the sites that we sampled as quote undisturbed areas, I thought were either quite low quality areas, or we would stand around and realize, oh, like there's an old foundation for a house. So it was, when we looked at it from, Google Earth images and things and old maps, it looked like there was nothing there. But then when we got to the site, I was like, well, I find an old bedpost over here, so I think it's been disturbed before. So it was really hard, and I didn't feel confident about it. So we just chose to set those aside for now. But I have a colleague, Pat Bowen, who is a viticulturist with Agriculture Canada, who's worked quite closely with the Penticton Indian Band and a couple other people who have areas outside the typical growing region who she's worked with to collect samples. So if we can get permission to use some of those data, then we might have a better undisturbed data set. It's in the works.
Is there concern with all the shifting of crops? So maybe we move crops around and you have to treat for the pathogenic bacteria and everything that are in the soils you mentioned previous, that you're limiting the ability for the microbes to sequester carbon later on because you're taking away those top 0 to 30 centimeters microbial community if you're treating pathogenic?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the phenomenon I think you're referring to is the replant disorder. Yeah, so again, this is research. I'm speaking for another colleague, that's Tom Forge, has really done a lot of work looking at alternative methods to help address this replant issue. So in the past, growers who suspected they might have replant would pull their orchard or vineyard and they would fumigate it with like methyl bromide or something that was really quite nasty. And it's increasingly difficult to get the chemicals that would be needed to do that. And in fact, Tom's work has shown that applying good quality compost or surface mulch is as effective or more effective at helping an orchard establish, and the effects last longer. So he's shown that there are lots of other viable alternatives that promote the soil microbial or soil biological community in a way that's more sustainable, improves the soil health, and is a longer-term solution. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great questions. And
Yeah,
what a great
really.
way to start off the season. Thank you.